As if it isn't intimidating enough to introduce an icon like Barry Jones without having a microphone. Can I just tell you why I'm intimidated? I wasn't going to tell this story, but when I first started at the MGSE, I was in my office, and a few weeks into the job, someone said, "Oh, be careful if you get in the lift with Barry Jones because he'll ask you what you're reading." And I thought, oh no, that'll be stressful. And then it dawned on me that my car was in the car park, parked adjacent to Barry's, and so his driver's door opened to my passenger's door. So I raced down to the car park straight away and removed the copy of the AFL football record off the front seat. So you didn't catch me, but I've owned up to it. Tonight we're going to hear from one of Australia's living national treasures, the Honourable Barry Jones. I had prepared some remarks to introduce him, but I was out this afternoon and came back about 45 minutes ago to find out that Barry has written a new paper, and my remarks don't match with what I thought was going to happen before. But I'm sure that you'll be very glad with the contemporary nature of tonight's presentation, Christchurch Racism and the Existential Crisis for Democracy. How will Australia's most highly qualified cohort respond? So I'm sure that a number of events that have happened in recent days will certainly be commented upon as we take great pleasure in listening to Barry tonight. We hope that there might be some time for questions at the end. So because Barry surprised me with a new title, I'm just going to be very brief with his CV, as you would appreciate, could probably contain all of our CVs together for the many achievements and the accolades that he's received. So let me just be brief and we can get on with the show. So Barry was born in Geelong and educated at the University of Melbourne. He's had an extensive career as a public servant, high school teacher, radio performer, university lecturer and lawyer, and of course television star. And I did a little bit of homework to prepare my previous notes by watching an episode of BP Pickerbox online. I don't know if any of you have been in there, but there's been thousands of people that have viewed that. And it was a great episode. It was from 1963, and the episode was about who were the first two presidents of the United States. And so Bob Dyer, as you'd remember, well, perhaps not all of you would remember, I remember, was the compere and a very famous man, and they asked one contestant who supposedly got this question right, and then they asked Barry who were the two presidents of the United States, and of course he answered correctly, George Washington and John Adams, but Bob told Barry that his answer was wrong, and it was in fact a man called John Hanson, and Barry not only answered the question correctly, but he also gave the dates that they were president and their vice presidents, and was waxing lyrical about how much he knew, and was taken aback when he found out that he had the question wrong. And of course, in his inimitable style, argued with Bob Dyer, and Bob said to Barry, "Are you going to give me an argument?" And he said, "Of course I will," and went on, and the whole thing was a joke. And because Barry had been on the show so many times and had never been beaten, Bob Dyer thought it would be a great game to play to see if he could trick Barry. But Barry still went on with it and explained why John Hanson wasn't the right answer, and talked at great length. So it was a fascinating show, and it's certainly worth watching. You might remember that Barry was on that BP Pickerbox from 1960 to 1968 in different shows, and attracted an Aladdin's cave of rich prizes and cash, and certainly made himself a household name. So I want to propose the theory that Barry might have been the inaugurator of reality TV in Australia, because and you've got a lot to answer for that, Barry, but so from Barry conversing with Bob Dyer and having the ability to be able to create humour and at the same time demonstrate what an intelligent, high-achieving Australian he was, I think brought people to TV in a way that they hadn't been there before, and certainly made that show and Barry into icons that have been treasured ever since. Probably not quite Married at First Sight, but certainly reality TV at the same time. In 2014, Barry was made a Companion of the Order of Australia, with the honour recognising him for eminent service to the community as a leading intellectual in Australian public life through contributions to scientific heritage, musical, medical, political and public health organisations, and to the Parliament. In Bob Hawke's government, He was best known as Australia's longest-serving Minister for Science, and in 1985 became the only Australian minister ever to be invited to a G7 summit meeting. I could go on and on and on and talk about many other things, but I'll finish with a quote, if you don't mind, Barry. I found this online from 2006 out of Crikey. Probably was an article that was a bit longer than this, but the quote I'd like to use is, Australian voters have always liked Barry Jones. The schoolmasterly manner and the precise, clipped speech earns respect. People might not know exactly what he's talking about, but it must be right, mustn't it? He won all those quiz shows, didn't he? He's a clever bloke, that Barry Jones. Can I introduce the clever bloke, Barry Jones?
Okay. Well, I was very grateful to Jim Watterson for his invitation to deliver a Dean's lecture in 2019. The last Dean's lecture I delivered was back in 2007 at the invitation of Field Rickards, and I'd come to the conclusion that the 12-year hiatus was not an accident. Now, I've very much enjoyed my position at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education, first as a Vice-Chancellor's Fellow for 2 years, since then as a Professorial Fellow. And the school, of course, has achieved richly deserved recognition as being #1 in education in Australia, among the first 6 in the world. Indeed, one could go further and assume in the galaxy. I echo Jim's words in acknowledging the prior ownership and custodianship of the land on which we meet, and pay my respect to Indigenous leaders, past, present and emerging. And I should preface my remarks with something of a declaration of interest. I served as an ALP Member of Parliament in Victoria for 5 years, Commonwealth Parliament in the House of Representatives for 21 years. I was National President of the Labor Party for 9 years, and now am an habitually critical life member. I still retain a collection of strong prejudices and dislikes, but I try to be objective and balanced in my writing and public speaking. You'll have to be the judge of how far I succeed in this. I want to talk first about Christchurch murder, racism, and the fear of the other. Since choosing my original title for this lecture and assembling the building blocks of my discourse, I've been horrified, together with this audience, by the outrage which occurred in Christchurch on Friday the 15th of March, when 50 Muslims were killed and 40 wounded by an armed attack on 2 mosques by a lone gunman. So I've changed direction away from the original title, and I've in fact retitled it, as Jim said, Christchurch, Racism and the Existential Crisis for Democracy: How will Australia's most highly qualified cohort respond? Since Brendan Tarrant, an Australian national, has been arrested and charged with murder, the ex-lawyer in me, remembering the concept of presumption of innocence, requires me to describe him simply as the accused. However, Tarrant's use of social media, the filming of the deadly attack, publication of his manifesto just minutes before the first shots, demonstrated an overwhelming desire to share his opinions with the world and to be taken seriously. The New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, has handled this crisis superbly, with grace, dignity and empathy of an exceptional order. She clearly has a high level of emotional intelligence. Australian responses might be charitably described as awkward. New Zealand is very lucky to have her. She puts Australian politicians to shame. President Trump's reaction was entirely predictable. True, he telephoned Jacinda Ardern. He would have been anxious to know whether she liked him. But his following comments in a press conference were appalling. First, he admitted he didn't know much about what had happened in Christchurch, but he thought it was just another mental health problem, an act by a deranged individual. Racism didn't come into it, nor the availability of guns, in Tarrant's case an AR-15. So Trump, yet again, was giving another nod to his constituency, exactly as he did after the mass shootings in Charleston, Charlottesville and Las Vegas. No need to change anything. Many racists are very fine people, and the First Amendment of the US Constitution, enshrining the right to bear arms, is the only part of the document that he's ever read. The only action we should take is do more in mental health. He should offer himself for diagnosis. The return of racism as an issue in Australian politics, although often unspoken, is a matter for deep concern. Australian politicians tend to describe racism in Australia by saying that it does not exist. We have our own version of white supremacy, different from the South in the US and from apartheid South Africa, muted, largely underground, but still there in some regions. Many influential Australians have an implicitly racist interpretation of Australian history, which they see as having begun quite abruptly in January 1788. In the 19th and much of the 20th century, what was described as the passing of the Aborigines was taken for granted. There were at least 270 massacres that we know of. They were taken away from their traditional lands, forbidden to speak Indigenous languages, removed from their mothers, and in many cases tormented, starved, shot, or poisoned. The last officially sanctioned massacre occurred in 1928 in the Northern Territory near Coniston Station. The White Australia policy in the Immigration Restriction Act was the first legislation passed by the Commonwealth Parliament in 1901. Sir Robert Menzies, our longest-serving Prime Minister, was a passive supporter of White Australia, although its imposition became less rigid in the last years of his tenure. He retired in 1966. His Liberal successor, Harold Holt, took active steps towards breaking down White Australia, although the process was not completed until after Gough Whitlam was elected in 1982. Holt led the successful 1967 referendum campaign for constitutional recognition of Aborigines. Whitlam was generally very supportive of multiculturalism and Aboriginal rights, and Malcolm Fraser was even better. Bob Hawke and Paul Keating, especially Keating's Redfern speech of December 1992, continued in the progressive tradition of openness on race. With John Howard's election as Prime Minister in 1996, racism again became an important issue in Australian politics after 30 years. He was a cultural warrior, deeply opposed to the black armband narrative of Australian history, committed to the values of a settler society, and willing to encourage white fears that the recognition of native title would drive Australians of European descent from their homes and land. He co-opted many of the policies articulated in a shriller fashion by Pauline Hanson. In September 1997, on ABC television, he held up a map of Australia in which 78% of the landmass was coloured brown, indicating areas where Indigenes would have a potential right of veto, a direct appeal to fear and ignorance. Kevin Rudd and the ALP won the 2007 election, and in February 2008, in the first item of business for the new Parliament, delivered the important sorry speech, an apology to Indigenous people, especially the stolen generations who had taken from their families. John Howard was intransigent in his opposition to a national apology to Indigenes and recognition of native title. Gough Whitlam, Malcolm Fraser, Bob Hawke, Paul Keating turned up in Parliament to show solidarity with Rudd as he delivered his sorry speech. John Howard was the only living former Prime Minister not to attend. Unfortunately, there was relatively limited follow-up to the sorry speech, and the progress of registering native title proved to be very slow and limited in application. Anders Behring Breivik, the Norwegian far-right terrorist who massacred 70 people in July 2011, wrote a 1,500-page manifesto in which he singled out 5 Australians for praise: John Howard, Peter Costello, Cardinal George Pell, historian Keith Winshuttle, and former Liberal MP, later talkback host Ross Cameron. However, it should be said in Howard's defence that he took strong and effective, in some cases unpopular action against guns after the Port Arthur massacre of 1996. He was courageously supported by Tim Fischer, leader of the National Party, whose rural base used large numbers of military-style weapons. Peter Costello's anti-Islamic rhetoric was superficial and unthinking, rather than deeply felt and primal, as you would expect. Dog whistle racism is prevalent in Australian politics, more obvious with Pauline Hanson and Fraser Anning. Senator Anning's performance post-Christchurch is central to his hopes for re-election to the Senate in May. In 2016, he had a primary vote of only 18, that is not 18%, just 18 votes. To have even a remote chance of winning, he must establish that he's Queensland's premier racist and harvest that vote. The existential crisis for democracy. We run the risk of taking democracy for granted. It's been a very fragile flower of very short duration in human history. The first humans on the Australian continent are now thought to have arrived about 65,000 years ago. For millennia, human society was run by powerful hierarchies, mostly tribal, divided by race, language, culture, and religion, with the numerous weak ruled by the powerful few, overwhelmingly male, who owned the land and the slaves, ran the institutions, sold their daughters, and garnered the wealth. Australia is unique for having been the only settler country set up by and for convicts. Occupation by Europeans in the brief period since 1788 began as a prison. Apart from convictism, the other building block of the British invasion was Aboriginal dispossession. At the end of the 1780s, during the intellectual movement known as the Enlightenment, at precisely the time that Britain sent the first fleet to New Holland, the United States inaugurated its first president, George Washington, April 1789, and the French Revolution began with the fall of the Bastille in July. These events marked the beginnings of a series of democratic experiments in several nations, although few men had the vote and no women. The period from the fall of the Bastille in July 1789 to the fall of the Berlin Wall, November 1989, was just 200 years. Britain only took its first timid steps towards parliamentary reform in 1832, just a century before my birth, although I make no claim that the events are related. The slave trade was abolished, in theory, in the 19th century. The United States abolished slavery in 1865, Brazil in 1888. But slavery and slavery-like practices are still widespread in Asia, the Middle East, parts of Africa, and Eastern Europe. It even exists, rarely, in the United Kingdom and even Australia, with some female sex and clothing workers. The Australian colonies, despite their convict foundations, perhaps even as a reaction to them, soon developed its own movement towards democracy, providing for manhood suffrage in the 1850s. New Zealand followed in 1889. Although New Zealand gave women the right to vote in 1893, Australia was the first country in which women could both vote and stand for election. That was in 1902. The provision of compulsory primary education in Great Britain, much of Europe, the US, Canada, Australia and New Zealand in the 1870s was regarded as a necessary step towards personal development and democratic practice. However, while Germany was the best qualified nation in Europe, the democratic ethos failed to flourish there. It could be argued that the period after World War I ended in 1918 was a high point for democratic forms, with the creation of many new states after the Austro-Hungarian, Russian and Ottoman empires broke up. But in many cases, the beneficiaries of democracy were xenophobic populists. Hitler's rise, for example, would have been impossible under the old imperial autocracy. Democracy failed for 2 generations in Germany, Italy and Spain. After the Russian Revolution in 1917, totalitarian rule by Lenin and Stalin crushed democratic practice or liberal dissent until Gorbachev's reforms in the 1980s. In China, after Mao Zedong took power in 1949, the Communist Party maintained a political monopoly, although later Deng Xiaoping introduced significant economic reforms, adopting some elements, often bad ones, from the market economy. Colonialism ended in effect after World War II, but while most former colonies adopted democratic forms, many lacked a democratic ethos, and elections are either often corrupt, the leadership and armed forces brutal. However, India adopted and has maintained democratic forms. There was a move towards greater openness in the so-called Arab Spring from 2010, but it soon returned to winter. Some political scientists use the words anocracy to describe states with democratic forms, but where wholesale corruption, gerrymandering of electorates, wholesale bribery and intimidation mean that elections are not free or fair, and they further divide autocracies into open, Cambodia, Iraq, Papua New Guinea, Myanmar, Singapore, or closed, Uganda and Egypt. While some classifications about particular countries can be disputed, it's reasonable to estimate that about 40% of the world's population live in democracies, perhaps 20% in anocracies, and 40% in autocracies, of which China is by far the most populous. Democracy currently faces its greatest existential crisis since the 1930s. Hitler used democratic forms to come to power in Germany, but rejected the democratic ethos. What is sometimes called the Enlightenment Project has come under sustained attack in the United States, much of Europe, and to a lesser degree, so far, Australia. There's been a sharp crisis of confidence in democratic practice and the quality of leadership in the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Italy, Austria, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, many other European states, Russia, Turkey, most of South America, and Africa. The global scene was marked by the rise of rightist, nationalist, anti-immigrant, and protectionist parties, authoritarian rule, corrupted elections, the emergence of kleptocratic rulers, suppression of free speech, suspension of the rule of law, resort to violence, and adoption of the surveillance state. In my book, Sleepers Wake, in 1982, I predicted the impact of the information revolution long before it was fashionable, and I was generally optimistic about its outcomes. I was wrong. Hannah Arendt wrote that in an ever-changing, incomprehensible world, the masses would at the same time believe everything and nothing, think that everything was possible and that nothing was true. In the digital age, opinion has become more important than evidence, and that far from exploring the universal and the long term, social media emphasises the realm of the personal or the tribal in the short term. We accept the proposition that all votes in an election should be of equal value, irrespective of the extent of experience or non-experience by individual voters. But, and here's another paradox, does that mean that all opinions are of equal value and should be treated with equal respect, so that vaccinators and anti-vaccinators should have 50-50 access to the media, for example? Politicians are no longer constrained by a moral obligation to tell the truth. John Stuart Mill coined the term fractional truths. Fractional truths, as a practice that's caught on alarmingly. Something that was true yesterday and might well be true tomorrow is not necessarily true today. We now have a sharply reduced political agenda, a refusal to analyse and explain complex, or as we sometimes call them, wicked problems, climate change, jihadism, refugees. There's convergence, largely out of fear, on major issues like taxation and national security, generally, anyway, convergence, and toxicity on trivial issues, personal attacks, gotcha moments in the Parliament. There's a retreat from evidence, rational argument, analysis, and the use of statistics. And in controversial areas such as climate change and asylum seekers, opinion carries more clout than evidence. Expert opinion is denounced as elitist. The quality of political debate on climate change has been abysmal for the past decade. We're incapable of talking about planetary issues because the planet has no vote. In 1995, the New York Review of Books published an important essay by the great Italian historian, philosopher, and novelist Umberto Eco, author, of course, of The Name of the Rose, called Ur-fascism, i.e. eternal or primal fascism, in which he listed 14 general properties of fascist ideology. He argues they could not be organised into a coherent system because some are contradictory and typical of other types of fanaticism and authoritarianism. However, Eco argued, it's enough that one of them be present to allow fascism to coagulate around it. 24 years on, at least 5 of these general properties are current, not only in the United States, but to a lesser degree in Australia too. First is the appeal to social frustration. One of the most typical features of historical fascism was the appeal to a frustrated middle class, a class suffering from an economic crisis or feelings of political humiliation and frightened by the pressure of lower social groups. Second, the obsession with a plot. The followers must feel besieged. The easiest way to solve the plot is the appeal to xenophobia. 3, the enemy is both strong and weak. By a continuing shifting of rhetorical focus, the enemies are at the same time too strong and too weak. Selective populism. There is in our future or TV or internet populism in which the emotional response of a selected group of citizens could be presented and accepted as the voice of the people. And finally, Ur-fascism speaks newspeak. All the Nazi or fascist school books made use of an impoverished vocabulary and an elementary syntax in order to limit the instruments for complete and critical reasoning. I mean, this is straight out of George Orwell. If you make the language so simple, you can't deal with complex concepts because the language is too basic to be able to handle them. The President of the United States lives in a Trumpocentric universe in which everything revolves around him, in which his self-absorption is the main driver of action. The concept of truth is irrelevant, evidence is discounted or dismissed as fake news, gut reactions and instinct override analysis, evaluation, and the need to consult widely and take account of contrary views. He has the attention span of a hummingbird and the emotional reactions of a greedy child. Political paralysis. In the decades after World War II in Australia, politicians were generally well ahead of public opinion on many issues. For example, the mass migration program, ending white Australia, abolishing the death penalty, divorce law reform, ending homosexual discrimination, or rather homosexual decriminalisation, access to abortion, recognising the People's Republic of China, reduction of tariff protection. The 1967 referendum to recognise Aboriginal in the Constitution did receive overwhelming support, due in part to a consensus by the major parties and the lack or the absence of an organised no campaign. Australia was a democratic innovator, and major reforms included significantly expanding universities, creating probably the world's best national health scheme, significantly reducing tariffs without causing large-scale unemployment. In recent years, politicians have been well behind public opinion on issues such as same-sex marriage, effective action on climate change, transition to a post-carbon economy, protecting the Great Barrier Reef and other heritage sites, voluntary assisted dying, ending live animal exports, and the Republic. Politicians are fearful of antagonising powerful minorities and of being wedged. Many politicians and political operatives, apparatchiks, have not just lost the capacity to debate, they never had it. When I was first elected, in fact, when Brian Howe and I were elected on the same day in 1977, nothing's ever been the same since. When we were both elected to the House of Reps, there were outstanding debates, often by members without much formal education. But they had two things in common: life experience, much of it very tough, and they were prodigious readers. But they could also understand a counter-argument and knew how to rebut it. I should add, of course, that they had three more things in common. They were all white, they were all men, and almost all of British or Irish descent. This was not exactly a golden age in representing a cross-section of Australia, Brian and myself excepted. We've now entered an era of policy paralysis with a significant failure of nerve by those who purport to be leaders. MPs often rely on a page of dot points that they've been handed with no understanding of or interest in a contrary point of view, and simply declaim the material they've been given, staying on message and repeating mantra after mantra ad nauseam. The last serious debate in Parliament on the Republic was in 1998, on the environment in 2009. Neither major party will debate a fresh approach to the refugee asylum seeker issue, leaving it to independents or Greens in two houses, which currently lack a government majority, to initiate action, as with the Medivac vote. It may be that democracy is not so much in trouble as its practitioners. There's a massive failure of confidence, a collapse of trust for a variety of reasons in our major institutions, for which the revolving door prime ministership, an Australian speciality, has become a central factor. those institutions, of course, now just run through Parliament, the political parties, the churches, schools, banks, insurance, aged care, prisons, retailers, the media, some elements of the armed forces and police, some elements of sport, the national religion, electricity retailers, the gambling industry. There's still a high degree of trust for some important institutions. The courts, mostly, although they do sometimes come under attack from the media, CSIRO, the ABC, the Bureau of Meteorology, the Australian Electoral Commission, universities, mostly, medical practice, research, emergency services and disaster relief. Significantly, most of these institutions are under threat from tight-fisted governments. As a result of this political malaise, there's been great reluctance to tackle a series of important issues which I've described as Australian exceptionalism. Now, because of my change in direction in this Dean's lecture, I've provided the list in paper form and will be downloaded when this presentation goes online. So I won't go through. They've got it set out there, but you've got a piece of paper in your hands, I hope, and there are pieces of paper out there. I mean, my calculation is if I go through each of the 40 elements in it, we'll be here till about probably about Thursday morning. So I'll cut back on that. But the significant thing about these issues, they're all issues which are not addressed by the Parliament, which are not addressed by the political process, and they're all important. But they've completely dropped off the political agenda, and many of them are really very serious. 6,500,000 graduates. Where are they when we need them? When I began as an undergraduate in 1950, Australia then had 7 universities with a total enrolment of about 33,000, overwhelmingly male. University of Melbourne was the only one with that name, university in Victoria, with about 4,500 students. And at that stage, primitive as we were, we only used eyes, ears, notebooks and pens. The number of universities trebled under Menzies' long prime ministership. Enrolments passed 200,000 in 1973, 8 years after he retired, and Gough Whitlam was in office. And that was when it was possible to pay for free university education. In 2011, the percentage of the population with a bachelor's degree or higher was more than 9 times the figure for 1971. Now it's 27%, 14 times higher than in 1971. And of course, since the late 1980s throughout Australia, female university students have outnumbered male. In 2019, Australia has 40 universities plus 2 overseas institutions, with a total enrolment of 1.3 million. About 1 million students are Australian nationals, more than 300,000 international students, with another 200,000 in private colleges. Pro rata, Australia has more international students than any other country, and Victoria leads all states. That ought to mean that the level of community engagement and commitment to working out complex issues and finding solutions ought to be at an unprecedented level. Right? Well, no, wrong, actually. Paradoxically, one could argue there's been an inverse relationship between the growth of universities and the level of community engagement in politics. Nature notoriously abhors a vacuum. At present, there's a serious withdrawal from political and public engagement by people with high levels of education or professional skills. They've deserted the field of action with disdain, wring their hands, express dismay or even contempt for the political process, but refuse to engage. I can understand these feelings, but they damage the political process. The politics of reason and knowledge is being displaced by the politics of frustration and anger. Universities, I regret to say, are taking a very low profile on public controversies. A senior academic at this university offers an explanation. Political discourse has been polarised into an us and them competition, whereby making a statement as a university will not just be fairly criticised, but turned into vicious, virulent comment, usually personalised, so that anybody sticking their head above the parapet risks having it shot off. One of the most pernicious effects of social media is that a witch hunt quickly brews up, often leading to good people who are simply expressing an opinion against the views of a small but aggressive group being decapitated and even having to resign. That's worse than being decapitated, apparently. On the other side of the coin, the press are also guilty of similarly appalling witch hunts and promulgation of opinions that have no basis in fact. When taking politicians to task, there's the added risk of vindictive retribution in terms of funding being withheld and other less overt measures. Taking a high profile on public controversies then quickly becomes an act of courage associated with very high personal and institutional risk. Media advisors and lawyers then tend to advise that there should be no comment. To go against this advice is a hard road to follow. There's 30,000 of us, of them, and only 15 million of us. In elections for the House of Representatives, where the fate of governments is determined, most electors cast an instrumental vote in what is essentially a two-horse race between the coalition, Liberals and Nationals, versus the Australian Labor Party. In the election for the Senate, many citizens cast an expressive vote, not to form a government, but to indicate their personal concerns about the environment, about growth being seen as an end in itself, and the Greens have been beneficiaries there. So, with proportional representation, independents, Pauline nations, one nation, can win seats, although they have no prospect of being in government themselves. I've described the coalition and the ALP as the hegemonic parties. And most voters are so far loyal to the hegemonic parties on polling day, but many cast their vote with pegs on their noses, and they have no interest in joining. Our major parties claim to have a total membership, on paper anyway, of about 80,000. That is, about 0.6% of voters. In reality, it's more likely to be less than 30,000, not all of whom will know that they hold party tickets. By contrast, total membership of sporting, especially football clubs, would be somewhere north of 1 million, a differentiation of 1 to 33. There are more than 15 million Australian voters. But voters, even when they're troubled by the system, wring their hands, withdraw from engagement and say, in effect, well, what can we do? There's 30,000 of them running the parties and only 15 million of us. We're powerless. The hegemonic companies are essentially shelf companies with small, ageing membership, large numbers of stacks, oligarchic, not democratic in practice. Activists are, in effect, traders, apparatchiks and future lobbyists. They're characterised by personality cults, factions and ethnic recruitment. The factions are job placement agencies. The politics of commitment has been replaced by retail politics, whose practitioners no longer ask, is it right, but will it sell? Shared experience. Democracy, if it's to work well, depends on having a knowledge base which enables voters, citizens to make informed choices in an election. But is the basic information there, even in the age of the IT revolution, with the capacity to access infinite sources instantaneously without the hard grind of traditional learning practice? In recent weeks, I've been struck by the number of letters in newspapers, remember them? Deploring the decline or elimination of what used to be called civics, education, and admitting very frankly to gaps in their own knowledge. They write, in effect, and here I'm paraphrasing, "I don't understand how Parliament works, or the political parties, or the banks, or insurance, or most of the issues that are argued about in all forms of media. I don't understand the issues in climate change or the environment because the people who run the system assume that I understand it all, but it's never been explained to me." It's clear that in the notorious Brexit vote in the UK in June 2016, that both arguments for exit and remain were very poorly put. Many voters did not understand the full range of arguments, both for and against the proposition. I conclude, as you knew I would, by referring to Newton's third law of motion. Isaac Newton published his laws of motion in 1686. The third law, "Every action has an equal and opposite reaction," seems curiously applicable in history and the social sciences. A push towards breaking down misogyny, hierarchy, racism and fundamentalism, ending censorship, opening up religious freedom, often produces a revival of white supremacy, justifying hate speech and trolling as essential elements of freedom of speech, including demonising minorities. An authoritarian leader in Australia seems implausible, but then reflect that the prospect of Donald Trump winning the Republican nomination in 2016 seemed far-fetched, and his election a virtual impossibility. We know better now. Australia used to be a great political innovator, convict origin notwithstanding, well ahead of Great Britain with the secret ballot, universal male suffrage, votes for women, and Labor played a great role in promoting change. This is no longer the case. The political system is producing more cynicism and withdrawal from action and outcomes. We must engage in deep analysis of possible future directions and act with courage. It's up to us all, especially informed citizens, to say to the major parties, things must change, you lack courage, you refuse to engage in serious debate, and you reject democracy in favour of oligarchy. Currently, party leaders work on the assumption that most voters will fastidiously avoid direct political involvement. Citizen passivity is their secret weapon. I close by quoting W.B. Yeats in his poem, The Second Coming. Things fall apart. The centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. What will be our legacy? Posterity will be harsh on this generation if we fail to act.